Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carolyn McClellan, and I am the Assistant Director for Programs here at the National Museum of the American Indian and a member of the Cherokee Nation. Welcome to today's program, The State of Rock Art in North America. It is a remarkable topic, and we look forward to a fascinating and intellectually engaging discussion. Before our formal program begins, just a housekeeping reminder. Please, if you have a cell phone, take this opportunity to turn it off or place it on mute because we are recording this program. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lawrence Loendorf, noted archaeologist and rock art specialist and an award-winning professor and author. Larry is founder and president of Sacred Sites Research, which records and analyzes pictograph and petroglyph sites and promotes their protection. He was educated at the University of Montana with a BA and MA in anthropology, and the University of Missouri-Columbia with his PhD in anthropology. He taught anthropology and archaeology and completed research at several universities, with the longest tenures at the University of North Dakota from 1971 to 1992 and New Mexico State University from 1996 to 2006. His research focuses on the Great Plains, the U.S. Southwest, ethnography, and rock art. He was part of the international team chosen to excavate Chauvet Cave, discovered in southern France in 1994. I have had the great privilege of working on a number of sites with Larry and other researchers in Wyoming and Montana. Please help me welcome Larry Loendorf.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you, Carolyn, and thank you to the National Museum of the American Indian and Elizabeth Gish and her crew who helped put this together. So my plan is, and I'm going to probably get wound up here too much, and so I'm going to have Carolyn sit behind me here and time me. So if I'm looking this way, and she tells me I got to get faster or shut up or quit doing it, then I'll have to do that. But I want to start with the fact that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the technologies that have been successful with rock art. Not so much about those that haven't been successful, but those that have been successful. And then I'm going to give you a couple of case studies from Montana and Wyoming, so you're going to get to see a couple of things that I've done, and I sort of emphasize those projects. I could have done some things other places, but that's where I've been working most. And then I'm going to get into the importance of NAGPRA and other sacred sites laws, but probably in the question and answer period is when we're going to do a little discussion about how important those laws have been to the protection and preservation of rock art. So you all know what I'm talking about. In North America, we call these images that are pecked into the rock or incised into the rock, we call them petroglyphs or engravings, but usually engravings is used in other parts of the world, and we call them petroglyphs in this part of the world. And so you can see on the upper left one up there, we love to find sites like that because you got a figure here that's very dark and behind, which means that this figure is superimposed on top of that one, and we love to find superimposition because we know this lighter colored bison up here is more recent than that darker figure down there. This figure here is about 5 feet across down here. It's fun to find those big ones like that occasionally too. Or they're made by incising. So they're pecked like that, or they're incised, where they're incised deeply into the rock. You can see a horse here and kind of a deer-like figure and a human figure here, or lightly incised, like this wonderful teepee that you see down here. The first question people ask is, how'd they make them? Well, here are the tools. We find those at the base of the panel. So it's just a sort of a sharpened end of a piece of quartzite, and they peck that into the rock, handheld. Doesn't take that long. People have experimented with it. You'd be surprised, You can make one in probably a half hour. You can make a larger one in maybe a day at the most. So they're actually, but they're very enduring once they've been made. The incised ones are made by a flake of flint or chert or a cryptocrystalline material, and that's just held in the hand and then just used sideways so that the edges of these are completely worn off on the sides where they've been rubbed in. These came from excavations at the base of rock art panels. And pictographs then are the other one, the paintings that we have. The most common color that we have is red, and we also have black, white, yellow, and occasionally green or blue, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes. This is in pretty good shape. These are at a site on Fort Carson in Colorado, and they're in better shape because they're in a little rock shelter, so they're protected. Way more common is to see something like this, where it's very faded and more difficult to see. But in fact, we have this, and one of the greatest successes that we have so far in rock art is in recent years is this thing called DStretch. And this was developed by a guy named John Harmon, so when we use DStretch, this is what we see. So here you see John Harmon, decorrelation stretch, www.dstretch.com. If you're interested in it, you can get it yourself. It's not expensive. It's a software that he developed that you can put onto a camera. So you see that image up there on the left? Pretty hard to see. This is what you see with DStretch. So, and look at this image that last year that I found. Can you see anything there at all? Very difficult, isn't it? This is what you see with DStretch. So this remarkable tool has given us just an incredible ability to be able to work with and to see things that we've not been able to see before. And in fact, if we're working with a site that we can see part of the image, this gives us the opportunity to see more of the image. So that here is a DStretch enabled camera, which we can take into the field with us. It's actually a software. You can use any digital image and take it home to your computer and work with it. But what we like is to have a camera like this that we can use in the field so that we can use it to help with the drawings that we do in the field. He actually, John Harmon has put it on, now it's on, and in fact you can use it on your cell phone. So you can actually call up, get DStretch on your cell phone and turn around, take a photo of the rock and see things that you weren't able to see before on the rock. Here we have Lori White, who is a recorder that works with us a lot. You can see that she's in the process of doing a field drawing, and she's sitting here drawing on this piece of paper. In this hand, she's got a DStretch camera. You can see these very faded images on the back here. She's doing a field sketch. She's going to then take that field sketch home, and she's going to work with that field sketch with other enhancing programs plus DStretch, and then she's going to put it on a drawing tablet, and then she's going to do layers, and she's going to continue to draw and do about 3/4 of the work is at home after she gets it home. And when she does that, this is what she finishes with that panel that you see there. So you see these are big shield-bearing warriors. These guys all have shields in their legs, and they've got these big shields in front of their faces. It's one of the more common designs that we have in that part of the world. You can see all of this mixture of colors with green and yellows and reds and etc. And of course, this is what we're after. We're after trying to do these kinds of drawings, so it's preservation through documentation. We're trying to preserve these things by documenting them as best we can as we move along with what we're doing. Now, the question is, how do you make those paintings? Well, the paint itself, it comes from mostly inorganic compounds, but there can be organic, like black for charcoal, but mostly it's going to be like ochres and other colored sorts of soil and minerals and etc. And occasionally you'll get an extender added to it. So they don't have enough pigment, so they'll mix something in with it. Like this, something shiny, it can be talc, it can be little bits of crushed quartz, or it can be pulverized bone that you'll mix in, and then you get the binder. This is the most difficult part. These parts are pretty easy to figure out. This is the most difficult part to figure out because we don't have a technique by which we can figure what they mixed it with to hold it together, to hold it onto the rock. We guess at things like animal fats. We're probably right. Could be plant rosins, bird eggs, etc. like that. We mix those things together and we have paint. There's some beautiful blue paint, or these. Here you see a magnificent gold, and these are basket maker age figures. They're somewhere around 1,700 years old. And they're in Canyon de Chelly, in the Canyon de Chelly area. This one's in the Round Rock area. So your question right away is, well, what'd they make that blue out of? How did they get that blue? And that really was a big question to us. Where did that blue come from? And in fact, we thought copper. Certainly it must be some copper base or something like that. Well, what'd we do? We used this new technology, this thing called PXRF, portable X-ray fluorescence. This is a machine that you can see the size of a oversized hairdryer. We take this into the field with us. Here you have Bonnie Newman holding it up over her head. She's not touching the pictograph, so she's not hurting it. You shoot that machine, hold it, and it shoots X-rays into the surface there. It doesn't harm the surface. And then you can come away with the constituent parts. It'll just read right on the top of that little computer that's on the top of that, all of the parts per million of all of the different ingredients that there are in the rock that's on there right there. You take it off the paint, you put it on the rock where there's no paint, and then you see what did I have when I didn't have, and what did I have when I had paint, etc., and you come up with the conclusion of what's in the paint. You know what we discovered? We discovered that it's iron. It's an iron-based pigment, iron phosphorus-based pigment. Look at that in nature. So you can get red, you can get white, you can get black, but look at that blue. And it came from, in other words, they collected and made that paint out of that blue color. What you can do with this machine, which is still a step even further, is one of the reasons that we like to have this machine, is that you can now set it up, and I've done this at a site on Fort Bliss in Texas. This is my son, working with my son Chris, who's also an archaeologist with the Autumn peoples at the Gila River community, and this is their PXRF machine. We've got it on a tripod so that we can shoot it for a longer period of time. Again, that allows us to get it very close to the rock surface and not touch the rock surface, so we're not hurting the painting when we put it there. And what we're able to do with this is we're actually able to work out batches of paint so that we can figure out, although they're all red, we can figure out the ingredients in the paint, and we can figure out one batch of paint. Can you understand how that would be helpful to us? Yes, because that means that we can go down the wall and we can say this painting's this batch, this is another batch of paint as you go down the wall. So it can be an extremely useful tool. I think it has a really good future to be able to help us with sorting out things as we go from one location to another. So it's at 10, all right. So, and then this thing that we have with Marvin Rowe, another of the big advantages, I'm talking about those things that we've been successful with rock art, and this is dating. Marvin Rowe has developed a way that he can date this paint pigment. And what he does, you can see he's sampling here. This does require a sample, so you have to be at a site where you've gotten the permission and you can take a sample of the paint. And what he does is he takes it home and uses this plasma oxidation process, and he puts the sample into, after he's scraped it off from the rock surface, he puts it into a tubular outfit there that you can see, a vacuum tube, and in the process he heats it up with a low temperature, and he gets the organic matter that was used in the binder to release and switch into a gas, and then he siphons that off and radiocarbon dates the gas. So if I've lost you, it's a process though that you're doing with radiocarbon dating, and you're getting the organic matter from the paint. What he does to be certain that that organic matter is not in the rock itself is he then runs a sample of the rock without the paint through the same process. And if he doesn't get any organic matter out of the rock, because as we all know, lots of rocks have organic things in them like sandstone, limestone, etc., have lots of things like snails and little pieces of wood and etc. in them, which makes them organic. So he runs it, and then he has, in other words, he realizes he hasn't heated it up enough, so he knows that he's dating it with using this process. This has been a really important addition to our understanding and being able to date and work with rock art. He developed this process. This particular machine that you see right here is in operation at the New Mexico Office for Archaeological Studies. And so we have that functioning machine, and we have his student, Karen Steelman, who has a very similar machine at the Shumla School for Rock Art in Texas. So we now have two dating for paint in the United States. Doesn't always work, but when it does work, it can be extremely helpful to us for establishing the age of these paintings. All right, I'm going to move into a little bit different place, and a lot of what I'm going to do from this point forward is going to happen in Montana. I'm going to talk about a couple of sites here for just briefly. Billings, Montana would be right here, which will give you some idea of where we are. That's the Montana-Wyoming line right there at the bottom of the slide. I'm going to talk about a couple of sites here. Here's Chester Medicine Crow. This is he's the son of the old war chief Medicine Crow, well known, and I was at that site with him in 1972. So some time ago, long before there were any laws about having to visit sites with American Indians, I went to that site with him, and you can see on the wall behind him, there's one of those shield-bearing warriors. You see that shield that I introduced to you with the spear coming out the side with the big round shield that's in behind him? And I asked him, what is that? Or we asked him, the people that were with me, I asked him, what is that? And he said, it's ghost writings. Ghost writings. He doesn't know what it is. It's what he would call ghost writings. So here I am at another site with Joe Medicine Crow. It's a nephew to Chester Medicine Crow. Joe Medicine Crow is better known. He died, at 102 years of age 4 years ago. And his pictures are in this museum and all around the place and elsewhere, and a well-known individual. And Chester Medicine Crow then, or Joe Medicine Crow, that you see in 1990, told me the same thing. He told me that these are, ghost writings. That to the Crow, these things were ghost writings. In other words, they're done elsewhere. Joe also had a favorite saying that he said to me, and he said to others, this happens to be from Peter Nabokov's dissertation, but he said it to me in a slightly different form. Anthropologists are a funny bunch. They either know too much and try to put words down your throat, or they don't know enough and they try to pump you to get you coming and going, So I like to think about that all the time when I'm doing this kind of research, because I hope I'm not putting words down somebody's throat. So I just try to think and try to remain as humble as I can when I do this sort of thing. At that same day that we were at that site with Chester Medicine Crow and Francis Bearclaw and Stuart Connor, another Crow Indian named Roger Stops was also with us. And we went across the way to another site called the Joliet site. And we went up to the site, and this is hard to see, but you can see there's a horse here, and you can see a star in the background, and I'll give you a drawing of it so that you can see what's up there. You can see a horse and a star in the background, and this is a tracing that we did at the site, and this is what Roger Stops walks up to this, and he says, the Crow read these scenes from right to left. He says, the rider captured a horse, the enemy's pursuing him. The riders fired a gun at this guy, and this guy, he's wearing a silver star. That probably turns back plenty because he wore a star on the Crow reservation. I'm standing there saying, what? I thought you guys told me these were ghost writings. What are you talking about? How do you understand what's going on here? And we come to understand that what they are one form of this art. This is something called narrative or biographic art. And these are, in fact, then related to ceremonial scenes or war-related stories that you can read from the rock. Now, before I leave the Joliet side, I have to show you this one. It's difficult to see. We had ignored this panel when I had worked at the site, and you can see that there's a figure here that you can kind of see. If you can see it from there, I'll show you again. This, fortunately, Tim McCleary didn't give up on this. It's covered with bird poo, and we hadn't recorded it. We thought it was probably graffiti or whatever, and Tim, who wrote a book, just his dissertation came out a couple of years ago, and he didn't give up on this, and in fact, he discovered, that is, these individuals that are wearing World War I uniforms, and he, in effect, read that it was in memory of Saint-Mihiel and memory of Argonne, so the battles of World War I, Argonne Forest. And in fact, Tim did a little bit of sleuthing around and discovered that these were Crow Indians who had been in World War I, come back from World War I, come over to the site where the war honors were, and put their images up there so that they would be remembered at that location. I find myself in Washington, D.C. with these war memorials, and etc. And they're great things, but I want you to understand that this site, the Joliet site, is a Crow-Indian War memorial. It's a war memorial to them, and all of these other sites, much like it, that I'm going to talk to another site right now, are also memorials to the Crow Indians and to their past. So I'm going to talk about a site right now I'm going to talk about a site that's located right here called the Horned Headgear Site. And so it's in central Montana. Billings would be down here at the bottom, a little bit, right essentially in here, up in the center of the state. I'm going to talk at Fort Union, which is at the junction of the Yellowstone River and the Missouri River. A man named Edwin Denig, who was in charge of the fort and actually did a number of writings on the Assiniboine Indian and the Crow Indians, and fortunately he had Indians illustrate his writings that he did. And another individual named Carl Bodmer, who was an artist that came up the Missouri River on a steamboat and was at Fort Union and did drawings of the Indians as they were camped around. And another George Catlin, whose name you know, was also at Fort Union and did drawings, etc. Their drawings become important to what we're talking about here. This was Assiniboine and Crow territory in here. It was great bison hunting country in the 1800s, the late 1800s. And in fact, so that other tribes also went there, like the Blackfoot and other tribes. But this was good Assiniboine and Crow hunting territory here. Here's the site. This is one side of it here and another side here. You can kind of see a figure up on this side. So that here you see that figure just a little bit better that's standing on this side. So you can see these are these incised type that you have. So here it is. You kind of see this incised figure standing and this horse rider over here like this. So that on this side, here's that horse rider in closer. Well, what's of interest? Well, this guy's wearing a straight up bonnet that you see there on the top of his head, but the horse is also wearing a bonnet, a feathered bonnet. Now, isn't that interesting? We got a horse wearing a feathered bonnet. Well, here's a drawing by George Catlin of a Crow Indian warrior, and look at what the horse is wearing. He's wearing a feathered bonnet, and this guy's wearing a straight up bonnet. So we got a pretty good guess going on that might be a Crow warrior right there, don't we? And this is on the other side, so this is the side that's very difficult to see, and so I'll show you a little closer. This is the teepee camp that you see on that other side. And you can see that we don't understand this over here, but you can see all the teepees. And the interesting thing is that they've got this darker bottom at the bottom side of the teepee. And if we look at this Bodmer painting, you can see it's got a redder bottom around here. And if we look at this drawing that was done for Denig by an Assiniboine Indian, you'll see the teepee has that darker bottom on it like that. So that in effect then, this pretty strongly suggests that that's an Assiniboine camp that you have there, because we've got Assiniboine teepees. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at this guy, you can see a series of tracks. They're very hard to see, but they're coming out of here. You'll see these tracks coming across here, and here are his feet here. And if we go to him, here he is, and here are his tracks. So he walked out of that teepee camp, which was an Assiniboine camp. But interestingly enough, he has this headgear up on the top of his head. And if we look at that headgear, you'll see that it is a Assiniboine antelope horn headdress, which is in this museum right here. So you can see he's got that same design on the top of his head up there. So then, here's another drawing by Bodmer of one of these same antelope horn headdresses that's got that same little material up on the top. So if you've been able to follow what's going on then, we have an Assiniboine camp, we have an Assiniboine warrior, and we have a Crow warrior that is fighting with the Assiniboine warrior. So we have a war scene that was put on the rock, and we're able to sort it out because, as Edwin Denig said, most Indians can carve on a tree or paint who they are, where going, whence come, how many men, horses, guns the party is composed of, whether they have killed enemies, lost friends, and if so, how many. And then, and emphasis is mine, and all Indians passing, either friends or foe, will have no difficulty in reading the same. So in effect, everybody could understand this stuff that we call narrative or biographic rock art. This particular kind of rock art then is one style, one kind of rock art that you're able to read if you can understand the key to it. And ledger art, these drawings on paper, are in many times the key that you can understand the ledger drawings, then you can understand the rock art. All right, so now let's move a little bit toward what we might call the ghost writing, or the other kind of rock art. And so to do that, I'm going to stay with the crow again, but I want you to be introduced to a plant called crow tobacco, Nicotiana multivalvus. This is the crow sacred tobacco, and here you'll see the seed pod. That's important because it's got that little division on the top of the seed pod with the crow tobacco plant that you see there. So we're going to move now to a site here on the Bighorn Canyon, which is located right along in here. Billings, Montana is right up here again. So you see these are the Pryor Mountains in the background. Here's the site. It's this cave up here at the top of this. And you'll see that to get to the cave, it gets a little bit steep when you get up there to the top of the cave. And then if you look down, you'll see that we put a ladder up to it, and you look down to the water down there below. That's a reservoir, and actually the water's at 300 to 400 feet deep, so the river itself would have been way down even further when the cave was there. Pretty obviously, this is not a place where people lived up in this cave. And in fact, this is once you get into the first chamber at the top of the cave, you do this little crawl through, and you're headed into the inside chamber, so you get into this one. And then when you get in the inside chamber, that's the view that you look out at the canyon on the other side. And then you turn around, and this is what you see on the wall behind you. It's covered with these paintings. And if you look at the paintings, you discover that some of them have these big things coming out of the tops of their heads. Their eyes are all kind of staring eyes. They've got little extended ears off the tops of their heads. They take advantage of all of the holes in the rock for the eyes, like the figures are coming out of the rock itself, and then you crawl from this place through this little chamber, and you go into this room, and you have this guy who's hanging on to these plants that we think are crow tobacco plants. So that you've got these images that Mark Willis has done with this three-dimensional photograph, that you can see that he uses this thing called structure for motion to be able to make these excellent sort of see in depth kind of photographs that he does. And you can see these plants, and you might first guess corn, but the crow didn't grow any corn. And so then you say, well, then what other plants did they grow? And they grew this tobacco, as you're going to see here in a few minutes. And so then you look at the other side of the wall, and you see this guy, which has got this sort of that same kind of extended ears, and he's got his hand on what looks like a bison, and then you've got this sort of transformational figure here. It's kind of turned into a bison, and he's got like a human-like body, and he's got bison-like feet, and here are a couple of tracks next to him to sort of emphasize the fact that he's sort of turned into a bison. You've got this kind of transformational kind of, now we're talking pure shamanism, we're talking about trance-related states, we're talking about people going on vision questing, we're talking about a completely different kind of art than I was talking about before. So that here, in fact, is a Lakota drawing of a buffalo dancer, and you'll see you've got the same thing. You've got this guy here, it's got one human foot, and he's got one buffalo foot. So he's being transformed into a buffalo. Just as I just showed you on that wall up there, that individual was being transformed into a buffalo. So, and if we look at the ceiling, and in fact, this big panel, Henry Old Coyote, a Crow elder in 1972, went into this site, and he suggested that it was ghost writing. That same idea that the other crow had told me. In other words, it's something that's ghost, it's something done by people, it's ghost type stuff that we don't all understand. Whoever did that is the person that has to be able to understand it, if they understand the images that are there. So it's this different kind than that narrative kind of rock art that we talked about. Interestingly enough, on the ceiling, up above this panel, you have this figure that's got that flat thing over the top of his head. He's got kind of a flat headdress going on over the top of his head. And if we go to another site, we've left this one, we're going to go over here on the other side of the mountains, and here up here in this little cave that you see right here, we have this figure, and he's got that same flat headdress over his head. Here's another one. He's got that flat headdress over his head. And you'll see that that flat headdress has that plus in the bottom of it. And we find that interesting. You'll see that it's got little branches coming off it. And look at that tobacco seed. It's got that same plus design on the top of it. And this all started to make more sense to us when we found this photograph of a Crow Indian woman and her husband going to a Crow Tobacco Society meeting. And she was wearing a tobacco headdress on her head, or it's probably juniper with tobacco woven into it, so that that seed then represents that tobacco headdress that you find on the top of this individual that you have here. So, Richard Throssell photographed the Crow Tobacco Society, which is they did not smoke their sacred tobacco. They used it for ceremonial purposes. They smoked another kind of tobacco. They used the sacred tobacco for scattering and for other purposes, that if they needed for prayers and etc. with the sacred tobacco. And people are adopted into the Tobacco Society, and you'll see here's the adoption lodge, and in the adoption lodge there is this altar, the adoption altar, and you can see it's got these loops on the side. It's made of a willow frame, and it's got a cedar lined base onto it. And then next to that is the tobacco garden. And you'll see here's the garden with the furrows in the garden, and it's got a brush wall around the outside of it, so that they would go from the tobacco garden to the adoption lodge back and forth. And these same things then, the plants and the garden, are put on Crow Society tobacco bags, so that you'll get images of the tobacco garden and the seeds in the garden, and you'll get the plants, the tobacco plants, and the seed at the bottom of the plant, done in beadwork and in paintings and etc. on Crow Tobacco Society bags. Now I'm going to look at this place, this big huge rock shelter that you see here near a town called Sleep, Wyoming. And down in there you'll see this image. You'll see that here's the tobacco plant. You can see that off over here on the side. Here, I'll give you a DStretch of it a little bit, so that here's one side over here. You'll see it's hard to see. Here's the DStretch. But you can see what's going on. You'll see here's the wall. That's the wall around the tobacco garden. There are the furrows, and there's the seed, the tobacco seed, or the plant that's in the tobacco garden. So, and if we look, you'll see that here's this very faded image over here. This is adjacent to it. And you'll see that, what does that look like? That's that loop-like figure that you see, so that there are the loops. So that's that altar. That's that adoption altar that you see, which is adjacent to it. So that here's the garden, and here's the altar. So we have the adoption lodge then, and we have the garden next to each other in the very same fashion that the Crow would put their tobacco garden and altar and etc., the adoption lodge and position next to each other when they were actually in operation. This made us start to wonder if, in fact, that area, that big floor area, the paintings are over here, if that big floor area might have actually been a Crow tobacco garden. There was enough sunlight in there, so we wondered, was this in fact a Crow tobacco garden? And we then put in a test unit and dug down with the test unit to see if we could recover some pollen. And you can see that in this test unit that we have, that you can see this dark layer down here. This is scattered. We're down below the surface about 20 centimeters. So what we did was we took a series of pollen profiles. We took them out of this wall here, so that we have 3 levels of pollen profiles that you see here. And in the pollen profile, now to explain this to you, these represent percentages. These are the three. This is 1, 2, 3 that we took out of the wall. These are percentages of different kinds of pollen. Pollen is almost indestructible, and it can be recovered and then identified because each little piece of pollen is different for different plants, so that you can identify the pollen and figure out which plant it represents. This over here represents charcoal. This over here represents pine pollen, spruce pollen, tree pollen. And if we look at this area across here, this represents the grass pollen and that sort of thing. And this one right here is tobacco pollen. So that you can see that from this area to this area, over 50% of the pollen that we found is tobacco pollen. That's a pretty strong case for the fact that there was a tobacco garden in that rock shelter. And so, in effect, that garden then may have had an adoption lodge associated with it, but it very clearly then represents some sort of a different kind of art. Now, interestingly enough, Grant Bulltail, a Tobacco Society leader, went there, and I asked him, and he said, this is Crow tobacco, and this is in 2006 that we were there, and in fact, he suggested that it probably is narrative, that they're simply commemorating the fact that they had a garden here in this location. So if you followed what I've done here, or tried to do for you, we have ghostwriting related to Crow tobacco, so that we have tobacco plants, and we have ghostwriting, we have things that are related to vision questing related to Crow tobacco, and we also have narrative rock art related to Crow tobacco. So with the same genre, with the same thing, with simply working with Crow tobacco, we have two kinds of rock art. We have two different reasons that rock art was made. And I think the lesson here that we're learning from the Crow in this regard, the big lesson is that we get sometimes way too carried away. Like, for example, right now there are huge debates going on, not huge, but debates going on in Europe about whether or not the paintings in the caves in Europe are shamanistic, or if they're related to hunting magic, or if they're related to, and in fact, I think what we end up doing is we get too monolithic, and there are multiple reasons why we can have this kind of art, and I think this demonstrates these multiple reasons as to why we can have this kind of art with what the Crow examples that I've given you here with these two kind of case studies. Now, this is the portion that I'm going to save for the question and answer session, so that I still have 5 minutes left, she's saying, so that I have, or 4 minutes left or something. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, you have your time. All right, yeah. Anyway, but in essence, what I'm going to say here is that you will discover that rock art has not been all that popular in American archaeology. Some of you very well may know that. In fact, rock art people are largely, and it's been largely supported by the avocational community, and many of the bits and things done with rock art have been done by people who have been interested in it but not professionally trained as archaeologists to work with rock art. And in fact, thank heavens that they've done that, because a lot of the recording that we have done has been done by people from the avocational community. But the archaeological community had not really accepted rock art, and there are many, many professional working archaeologists who do not work with rock art or do not understand rock art. What's happened is, with these laws, with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, with ERFA and with NAGPRA, and with the sacred sites laws, American Indians have been allowed or are given the opportunity to gain access to their sacred sites. So that means that the federal land managers across the West, those people who are Bureau of Land Management or United States Forest Service or military reservations, the Navy owns huge numbers, the Army, large numbers of rock art sites on their lands, they now need to work with consultation with American Indians. And when they take the American Indians out onto their places to show them the sites, 90% of the time, the Indians say it's the rock art that I'm interested in. It's the rock art that are our sacred sites. So now the archaeologist, who wasn't trained in the rock art, all at once has to be trained. Are you understanding me? So that all at once the rock art became important, and it's moved it forward. If I haven't totally lost you here with where this is going, it's moved the whole bit of working with rock art way more to the forefront than it was previously with these laws that are in place. So, and now we're going to move toward Carolyn's part of this presentation. And I'm here working with an individual, Ramon Abdullayev. He's from Azerbaijan. He was one of the individuals who was part of the Written in Rock program that Carolyn and I were involved in with students that she'll talk about, native students from the United States and from individuals from Azerbaijan. And he came back. He got a deal and did an internship with Sacred Sites Research and went with me and trained with me and worked with me for a period of time. And here I have him at a site where he's using a digital microscope, which is another of those innovations that we have, advances that we have with rock art. And he's using a digital microscope, which is used where you put it up and he's got a laptop in his hand. And what we're studying is we're studying the superimposition of the paint, and this can be extremely difficult to do sometimes if you have a lighter colored paint over the top of a darker colored paint. Then it can be very, very difficult to determine which is under and which is over, because the darker paint will bleed through the lighter paint and you can't really tell which is over. But if you blow the image up, you can see that with a magnified image, it becomes quite easy for you to be able to see that in this particular instance, the red was laid down on the wall first, and the black was put over the red, and then the yellow was put over that, and the white was put over at the very end. So, Carolyn, you're up. See, now we got to get you.